Hello and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 110, Aristotle's Rhetoric, the Forgotten Art. I just finished reading this book and it was absolutely fantastic. I had watched Vox's little review of that, which I highly recommend. I will link it down in the description because that is a great summary of this book and some of the key points, and we'll get into some of that. But I just wanted to kind of share my thoughts on it and stuff like that. To start out, I found it a fairly easy read, which kind of surprised me because it's a philosophical book, and some of the early stuff, I was kind of getting lost and things like that. But as things progressed, I kind of got used to his writing style and stuff like that. It was a pretty easy read. Obviously, this is translated, so I will give you the translation that I read. It was, if I can find the correct page here. The text of Rhetoric is from the 1924 translation by W. Rise Roberts. So that's the version I got. If you want to get the specific one, the actual version I have is from Castelia Library, and it is absolutely beautiful. But unfortunately, you can't get this one anymore. So, you might be able to get like a future reprint version of it, but if there's anybody that's interested in books and stuff like that, I definitely highly recommend Castelia Library. Go check them out at, I think it's archaven.com is where you can find their stuff. Let's see if this pops up. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Archaven Comics. Let's try that. Yes, it's Archaven Comics. So if you go to Archaven Comics and then go into their book section and then go to subscription. Oh, not that one. It's somewhere in here. Leather Books. Go to Leather Books. Go to Bindery. Boom. You'll be able to get the subscription for that. Somewhere in there. You guys can figure it out. But I gave you the general direction. All right. Now let's actually get into the the book. So, book is really interesting. One of the key things to take away from it is the idea of rhetoric. So, rhetoric is there's two different ways of speaking. So, through persuasion, there's dialectic and there's rhetoric. Dialectic is when you're trying to use facts and reason, stuff like that. It's what we associate a lot with science. Of here's my experiment, here's my hypothesis. This is what we're going to kind of do to get there, and then the other side of that is rhetoric. It's persuasion. It's trying to convince someone, hey, we should do this or that or whatever, and using various flares. Owen Benjamin is really good at this, as if for an example. Also, Donald Trump is famously good at this with his rhetorical flares and stuff like that. And it also puts so much stuff into context because you're like, some people get like all up in arms. You can kind of see this a lot with the mainstream news stuff where they're always like, oh, Donald Trump is lying and stuff like that, when really what he was saying, in a sense, they're correct when they say that, but what he was saying was hyperbole or exaggeration and stuff like that, and that's like a means of persuasion. And if you take that lens and apply it to the political sphere and a lot of other aspects of life, but I found it incredibly useful in the political sphere, you end up a lot less frustrated with politics in general because you understand that it's just a rhetorical offer or just a rhetorical way to kind of flare stuff, and it's really not as big of a deal as it initially seems if you take what they like. They don't actually believe what they're saying. They're just trying to convince you of something. Now there's a limit to that, and as he says, rhetoric always points to the truth. But let's get into that. So one of the opening things that he talks about, he goes through the 4 points of rhetoric, or maybe it's 5. Nope, 4 points. So I'm just going to read those because I think they do a good job of highlighting where it is useful. So it says, it has now been shown that ordinary writers on rhetoric treat of non-essentials. It has been shown why they have inclined more towards the forensic branch of oratory. I guess I didn't really need that. Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over the opposite, so that if the decision of judges are not what they ought to be, the defeat must be due to the speakers themselves, and they must be blamed accordingly. Before some, I guess on that point, that's kind of Robert Barnes has this great quote when he's talking about how to when you're a lawyer working for a client. He's like, if you have the facts, you pound the facts. If you have the narrative, you pound the narrative, and if you have nothing, you pound the table. That's a good way of thinking about rhetoric, like shorthand. And that's kind of addressing this, where people can use their rhetorical flair to get judges to make decisions that aren't in alignment with truth and justice. Uh, Before some audiences, this is the most important one. Number two, before some audiences, not even the possession of the exactest knowledge will make it easy for what we say to produce conviction. For arguments based on knowledge implies instruction, and then there are people whom one cannot instruct. Here, then, we must use as our model of persuasion and argument notations possessed by everybody, as was observed in the topics while dealing with the ways to handle a popular audience. And this goes into the fact that not everybody is convinced by facts and reason and stuff like that. A lot of people are convinced simply by rhetoric, by persuasion, by I mean, if you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, how many people just kind of went along to get along, kind of thing, and you could show them as many facts and stuff like that about mass or jabba jabba ding dongs, all that kind of stuff, and it wouldn't convince them of anything because they're limited to the rhetoric. And I think it's kind of a spectrum. Sometimes you're, in some aspects you're limited to the rhetoric, some aspects you're not, but it's an aspect that you have to be able to flow between. And some people can kind of progress into, but there are some people that are just gonna, that's how they operate, that's what they're into. And so it's a really way of understanding this, good way of understanding this. Number three, we must be able to employ persuasion just as strict reasoning can be employed on opposite sides of the question, not in order that we may in practice employ it in both ways. For we must not make people believe what is wrong, but in order that we may see clearly what the facts are, and that if another man argues unfairly, we on our part may be able to confute him. No, this is really important because if you try to argue, if someone's using rhetoric and you're trying to use dialectic, the rhetorical speaker will win. We'll get into that later. No other of the arts draws opposite conclusions. Dialectic and rhetoric alone do this. Both these arts draw opposite conclusions impartially. Nevertheless, the underlying facts do not lend themselves equally well to the contrary view. No, things that are true and things that are better are, by their nature, practically always easier to prove and easier to believe in. And this gets to the heart of what Vox says a lot of times, is the best rhetoric points to the truth. And so that's why some rhetorical flares just fall flat on their face, and some rhetorical flares seem to have such a bite to them, right? That's why, they were calling Trump fake news, and he did a twist on him, and he's like, no, you're fake news. And that had the label fit the character on the media far better than it fit him, and therefore it was able to be flipped in such a jujitsu-ish way that wasn't possible in the reverse. It is absurd to hold that a man ought to be ashamed of being unable to defend himself with his limbs. Point number 4 on Aristotle's Rhetoric and why it's useful. It is absurd to hold that a man ought to be ashamed of being unable to defend himself with his limbs, but not ashamed of being unable to defend himself with speech and reason, when the use of rational speech is more distinctive of a human being than the use of his limbs. And if it be objective, then one uses such power of speech unjustly might do great harm. That is a charge which may be made in common against all good things except virtue, and above all against the things that are most useful, the strength, health, wealth, generalship. A man can confer the greatest benefits by right use of these, and inflict the greatest of injuries by using them wrongly. Basically, he's just saying you have to be able to defend yourself in the realm of rhetoric and persuasion, and to defend yourself is not an evil thing, and to know how to use it isn't an evil thing. It's sometimes the only way. It's The great way that Vox describes it in the intro of this book is it makes no sense to try to talk English to a German speaker or Liberian to a French speaker, right? You just have to speak the language in which people understand, and so there should be no shame in using rhetoric in this manner. On top of that, he makes a distinction that you can't, and this is a issue that we face a lot in, oh, well, someone might use it for evil. Well, that's true of basically everything. So either you're going to outlaw literally everything, which if you've outlawed everything, you've outlawed nothing because it's unenforceable then. And then it's, the actual decisions are just capricious, which is kind of what we see right now. It's, we've had an over regulation of stuff, but that's a side note. But these are kind of some of the core things that really show why Rhetoric is such an important book and why I definitely recommend it. It's only 250 pages. It when I was reading it, I flew through it. It's not very hard to read, so I definitely recommend this as reading. And if you have a kid or something like that, and you know they're trying to figure out maybe recommended reading books for your kid as they grow up and stuff like that, I think Rhetoric should be on your list. It is a very important book to understanding and developing, and the sooner that people understand these kind of aspects, and we all understand it on a certain instinctual level, but truly a deep understanding of it and being able to use it can really help, especially those that are stuck in the dialectic so much, which is an issue that a lot of intelligent people run into, where they can see patterns that other people can't, and because they can see patterns that other people can't, they trying to explain the pattern that the other person can't ever possibly see isn't useful, and so they have to turn to things which they can understand in persuasion. Like a good example the other day, and this, I don't know if this necessarily falls under persuasion, but I think it does, is I was on an interview and they were talking about something that was 300 thou. Now most people, it's like, okay, well, what's 300 thou and stuff like that, and that's kind of when intelligent people are talking about these various models and stuff like that, that's the kind of thing that to them 300 thou, it's a thing that exists and it makes sense and it exists and that's what it is. But like, there's no frame of reference for someone who doesn't understand that model on the deep level that maybe the more intelligent person does, or just the person that developed the model does. But here's a really easy visual to get the point across. It's the thickness of a paperclip, a small paperclip. Boom! Instantly, message is conveyed in a very clear manner, and you don't have to like abstract out all these things. And that's one of the issues with dialectic, is it requires a certain amount of abstraction, where rhetoric is specifically doesn't. If there's levels of abstraction, rhetoric does not work. And so obviously you can always just go out and test your rhetoric by talking to people, see if you can convince them and stuff like that. But another easy way to kind of gut check yourself on your rhetoric is, does it require a level of abstraction to understand? If it does, it will not work. Unless that level of abstraction is generally known throughout the entire society. I can't think of an example right now, but it's, in general, I would say that something that you can't really use. So, getting into some of the other stuff, early on he talks about the distinction basically between the judiciary and the legislature. There's a lot of different little aspects he touches on throughout the book. And he says, leave as few decisions to the judges as possible, for they may make their decisions within short notice, where those of the legislators can make their laws after long consideration. And the idea here is long-form debate is less, and long consideration is less influenced by rhetorical flares than someone who has to make a decision over a short period of time. Also, the merits of the ideas can be debated by the whole cohort of the legislator, while a single judge renders the judicial decision after being presented evidence two opposing combatants. And this is basically you're relying on a single. The point of failure is smaller. I kind of go back and forth on this because we've seen throughout, like, more people making a decision isn't necessarily a good thing, but sometimes you want a committee to decide something and sometimes you don't. There's a great quote or whatever, which is a camel is what happens when you when a committee designs a horse, which is kind of funny. But a camel does have very good purposes in certain regards. So that's kind of one of those things where you need a balance of those different aspects. He also goes on to describe the different political forms, which is kind of interesting. And this isn't necessarily a rhetorical consideration, but I find it very interesting for kind of my own reflection and something to maybe consider for yourself. So he says there's four types of government: democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, and monarchy. And he splits monarchy into two forms. He splits it into kingship and tyranny. And these four governments have four end goals that they will work towards in hopes of realization. The end goal of democracy is freedom, of oligarchy is wealth, of aristocracy is the maintenance and education of the national institutions, and of tyranny is the protection of the tyrant. And I just find that interesting because, we always claim that we live in a democracy and stuff like that, but as we can see how things have played out, we don't really. But I find it interesting because of my own. If you've watched several videos on my channel, trying to kind of understand my own political beliefs and political structures that I would like to kind of see in the future, and it seems, kind of going through this, that I would fall under aristocracy. He describes aristocracy as so democracy is a form of government in which citizens distribute the offices of state among themselves by lot, whereas oligarchy, there is a property qualification. So interestingly enough, America technically, under Aristotle's definition, was an oligarchy because you had to be a landowner to vote when it first started. And then it shifted to an aristocracy. He defines aristocracy as under aristocracy, one of education. By education, I mean the education which is laid down by law, for it is those who have been loyal to the national institutes that hold office under an aristocracy. So basically, as the oligarchical property qualification kind of faded away, they substitute with an aristocratical institutions and stuff like that, and that's one of the reasons that our government is so locked down and stuff or not locked down, but controlled in certain ways by these various institutions. The left's long march through institutions is because this was a smart move because of this aristocratical shift in how we set up our society. That happened. I'd say the definite. It was a slow process, but the Civil War was definitely a major shift in this. And then he describes monarchy, as the word implies, is the construction in which one man has authority over all, and he splits it into two forms: kingship, which is limited by prescribed conditions, and tyranny, which is not limited to anything. So that covers that. And then what else did he talk about? Just one interesting thing that he points out is no one grows angry with a person on whom there is no prospect of taking revenge. And so I think that's a good thing to kind of watch in yourself is if you stare into the abyss too long, the abyss stares back and stuff like that. And that idea of revenge and stuff like that a lot of times various politics or things really outside of our control can make our blood boil. And that's where Marcus Aurelius' book, which I definitely recommend, has kind of helped. The Stoic has kind of helped me, look, if I can't control it, I'm not going to worry about it, kind of thing. There's obviously, you all always kind of slip back into wanting to control things outside of your control, but at least having that framework in your mind, and being able to kind of catch yourself on those things is definitely useful, I have found. But if you have no prospect of, if you are thinking about taking revenge on various things, in a sense, you're taking the first steps towards realizing that. And so maybe it's good to take a second and step back from the precipice and be like, why is this flaring up my emotions? Why is this getting me so heated? um, then part 15 of book 1, he kind of goes through how to rhetorically maneuver and stuff like that. I'm not going to go read through all of that, but that's a key point or part to kind of look out for, or particularly pay attention to, I believe. And then in book 2, part 12 to 15, he goes through the strengths and weaknesses of a young man versus an old man, and where they kind of peak. And what was interesting is that he set the prime between 30 and 35 for men. And I don't even think he talked about women. And it's interesting because there's a lot of people recently that have been talking about how 30 to 35 is the prime. And if you look throughout history, it definitely seems to be the case. Apparently, Rush Limbaugh one time said, nobody takes you seriously till you're 30 or something like that. And if you're someone like me, like I use Alexander the Great as like kind of someone to look up to and my model and stuff like that. And that's just setting yourself up for failure. Don't do that. Because like, you know, I'm like like I just got the right to vote, and I'm like, let's go conquer the world. And then like, you know, you hit 30 and you're like, I haven't conquered the world. I'm a flippin' failure. Luckily, what makes me feel better is Caesar did the same thing. He was 30. He hadn't really accomplished much in his life. He thought he was going to be a complete failure. And you know, obviously he's still in the history books and considered one of the greatest generals of all time. So there's still time. I'm not saying be lazy, don't put in the work and stuff like that, but you got to put in the reps in your 20s, and nothing's really going to start paying off until you hit in your 30s and stuff like that. That's just something for if there's any younger guys listening and stuff like that. Keep that in mind. You see that with so Caesar didn't get his break till later. Sulla didn't get his break till he's 50. Metternich didn't get his break till he was in his 30s. Otto von Bismarck didn't get his break till he was in his 30s. Like, it's literally like bang, bang, bang. Everyone is in their 30s. It is kind of crazy. Like, it's like there's that meme where like dude's digging, and like one more dig and you would have hit diamonds and stuff like that. And that's kind of like what it seems like. I haven't quite hit that. I just turned 30 this year. I haven't hit that ascendancy and stuff like that yet, but that's something to keep in mind. Put in the work in your 20s, set yourself up, but like understand that it's not really going to pay off until your 30s. And I think one of the things that can kind of set people up for failure is they think that the success is going to come quickly and stuff like that. But having that perspective of understanding when things are actually going to pay off, when you're going to see the return and stuff like that, it can be discouraging for some people because it seems so far in the future, which I get. Like I'm 30, went through all my 20s. I'm having a hard time visualizing out to 40. But having that understanding, I think, will set themselves up better. Put in the work in your 20s, and in your 30s it'll pay off. And I got kind of lucky where I just kind of accidentally did this because I started following Vox and stuff like that, and started doing a lot of reading and stuff, and things that just kind of interested me. And now, because I started doing a lot of reading and stuff like that when I was like I think like 26 to 30, there's a whole litany. I feel much better educated, much more well read, and all that stuff. And I still have a lot of work to go, but putting in the time over all those years and just chipping away and understanding. Look, you can't read everything today. But you can read something, and so just chip away at it, and over time it'll build up. And that's a good mentality to have for all sorts of things. This is kind of a weird tangent in the middle of this, but it's interesting to consider. Then later on in the book, Aristotle gets into writing styles and how to write stuff. He talks about prose and the two different kinds where you can have short and curt writing styles where everything is kind of explained within the sentence, and then there's like the free running style. I am, if you've seen well, I guess I don't put a lot of writing on the internet, but my writing is notoriously long-winded. I remember when I was writing my thesis, like there was something that when I was doing the review for my for my master's degree, like the reviewer guy was like, usually people have the issue of having too short of sentences, and you have the opposite problem where your sentences are too long. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, the other one is free running sentences which naturally flow, so that there is no natural stopping places, which is the issue I run into all the time. Is I feel like I need to put a stopping place somewhere because it's getting too dang long, but there's nowhere to naturally break it. Being that it seems to, and then yeah, I thought this just kind of stuck out to me because it really applied to me personally. And then one of the last things that he talks about is how to, and we kind of touched on this earlier, was Donald Trump's way he jests and stuff like that, and how things work and how to beat rhetorical flares. So he says, kill your opponent's jesting with earnestness and earnestness with jesting. So the corporate media takes themselves extremely seriously. So if you don't take them seriously, then it's a way to undermine them. Someone that so one of these things is don't be afraid of like the labels they throw at you, right? So a lot of times they're like, you're a racist, you're a Nazi, or whatever, and this causes you to be on the defensive. And oh no, I'm not this, blah blah blah, and it's like they set the framework by doing that. And so one of the ways that you can kind of break that framework is just by being like, no. So a great example is when I was in my fraternity, we had this joke house position called the house pussy, which is basically whoever was the biggest bitch in the house. And we had a guy that was gonna graduate, and so we needed who was the house pussy, and so we needed a new house pussy. And someone like was like, oh well, you know what? They tried to throw it at me, and I was just like, no, and like that just killed it dead right there, right? And that was a way to put earnestness against their jesting, because they're kind of joking, and I could have played it off playfully, but I was just like, nah. And it's like, well, obviously it just falls flat because rhetoric has to point to the truth, and because I was willing to stand up for myself, the label didn't stick. And that's a good example of kind of how these things work. Trump did this very well, as it was as if it was true. Hold up, I missed the sentence. So Trump was really good at this with the fake news example, like I talked about, where they tried to apply it to him, and then he's like, "Nah, it's you guys. Actually, you're projecting." And because it was true, it stuck. Another good example of this is SJW is very effective, as they cannot, with earnestness, assert the title which you gave them. So because you're calling them a warrior, they can't be like, yeah, I am. What about it, right? Because they're obviously not that, right? So that's using jesting to undermine, because they treat themselves as serious people, and then you're like, oh well, you're a warrior, but they can't honestly say that they're actually a warrior, and so it like undermines their credibility, or undermines their way of being able to stand up for themselves, and that's why it's really like Trump's thing with nationalism was really important, right? Is people used that as a deriding thing before Trump took office, and all of a sudden Trump was like, no, I am a nationalist. Like, why would I not be interested in the national interest? And because they were trying to use that as a deriding thing, and it's kind of the idea behind like the N-word type thing, but it never, on that one, I don't feel like it actually worked, and that there's no real coherent idea plan with that one in a rhetorical sense. But the nationalism was very powerful because he's like, yeah, I am. Like, what about it? And he's earnest, but then he also made it like nonchalant, and that just like nosedive that. You're like, oh crap, like we gotta work things out. And I think this a similar thing's kind of coming for racism. People are like, you're racist, and people will be like, yeah, so. And that's when, like, because you've seen kind of left wing politics and stuff like that freaking out, but it's trying to suppress this potential inevitability. I think it's an inevitability where someone says you're a racist, and they go, yeah, what's your point? Um, and that's happening in little corners and pockets and stuff like that, but it hasn't permeated the culture. And once it permeates the culture, then the probability of something really bad happening, or not bad, but a change um, in the ruling parties is highly likely. Uh, and so, as a last little thing for a rhetoric that I wanted to kind of give an example of, I listened to Part of the Problem quite a bit, which is a libertarian podcast. And so, one effective rhetoric, this does get into some abstraction, but I think it's well known enough that it would work. Is a lot of times they say, well, here, we're the third option or whatever. And I think it would be more powerful personally to say, it's about time to give America a second option, right? Because the Democrats and the Republicans are two wings of the same bird, right? They are the same thing. And so to give someone a different option, you have to go third party. Well, don't make yourself a third party. Lump them all in together. Look, they're in this camp. It doesn't matter if you vote for Republican or Democrat, you're voting for the same thing. Vote for me, I'm the third option. While Trump's around, I don't think this is going to work. But I think it is a potential option for libertarians, and it's something to kind of consider. And if you set up, so it requires a level of abstraction, but if you set up I think there's enough Republicans that kind of understand, or enough people disaffected with how the system works that can understand, hey, the Republican gets in there, they seem to not do what I want, and I'm a Republican. The Democrat gets in there, they don't seem to do what I want. And so, it goes back to George Carlin's joke of, there's a big club and you ain't in it. There's enough things permeated throughout the culture that I think this would translate, even though there is a level of abstraction within it. I don't know, give it a shot, see what happens. If it doesn't work, you just drop it and move to something else. That's the great part about rhetoric. Anyway, that kind of sums up my thoughts on the book, my ideas of rhetoric and stuff like that. It was kind of all over the place, but it was a lot of fun. Definitely recommend this book. It's a short read. It's a quick read. It's worth reading. Like I said, I will leave the link to Vox's summary of it. It's on BitChute, so go over there to check that out. It's really good, and it's shorter than my video, so that's a plus. Like, share, subscribe if you thought this was interesting. I really enjoyed talking to you about this today, and thank you, and have yourself a good day. Goodbye.